Bueno, buen día.
Good morning. My name is Cristian Inthamoussu. I work in the area of development in GeneXus, and I will tell you about how to go from design to implementation. Maybe I won't get you so excited as you were in the last presentation, but I'll do my best. The idea is before what we just said. Now we are talking about already having our design, and we want to go to the implementation phase. First of all, one question. Is design more important than technology? Or is it more important to see with what technology it's been done? We have this as an example, which is a music music player from 2011 until Apple invented the iPod by making it more usable, by changing the design, and then it hooked it on iTunes, and we all know what happened afterwards. Same thing with the phone. This was what we had in 2007. This was basically smaller windows in a cell phone screen. Then Apple came back and they said, no, this is not the way a cell phone's done. Usability should be something like this. So there was a change in the market there. Others came and others copied this. Now, going from hardware to programs, let's analyze the messaging programs. In Windows Phone, we have BlackBerry Messenger, Skype. These were the ones that we had in 2009. And then came WhatsApp. What did WhatsApp do? How did it become famous besides from being multi-platform? So it was good for any device. It facilitated anyone to communicate with any of your contacts because it linked my device to my phone number. So anyone on my contacts, I was able to communicate with anyone that was on my contact list. So this increased the way of expanding because I wanted my contacts to have that, because instead of sending an SMS that would cost me such and such amount of money, I could use this for free with WhatsApp. Another example is with taxis. The usual way for requesting a taxi is we call an operator. That operator answers, then it tries to find a taxi next to us, near us, and it will tell us it will come in a certain amount of time. In 2011, this company, Easy Taxi, appeared, and what it did was to include several technologies in your cell phone and GPS. And for those of you who don't know about this, it's a phone application where you open it, a map appears where you are, and only with one button where it says request a cab. And when you hit that button, it automatically looks for the nearest taxi to you, and it lets you know that it needs to pick you up. After that, you can take a look at the phone and see all the data of the person who's coming to pick you up, what model, what taxi, what way he is coming through, and you will know exactly when he or she will arrive. So it's a revolution in terms of trying to take a cab. So I think that this will also be very good in terms of the market. So is design important? Yes, I believe so. And I think that most people think this. Design is becoming more and more important. Let's now see how I've divided this presentation. First, we will identify the problem that we want to solve. Then let's see how we work. And third, we'll analyze some ideas that we have. First, identify the problem. The development steps that we should follow. First, we have the more abstract or initial phase that involves wireframes, mock-ups. These are the first. Then we have detailed design, which are more detailed screens. Then we have the prototype, which is where GeneXus comes in. And then further on, we have other stages. And you get to the DT and deployment stage at the end. These first parts would be the design parts. Even though we will work with these two, in this presentation we will focus in this one and as to how to go from the second one to the third one. This passage from detailed design to prototyping is something that takes a lot of time. And what we want to do is to help in that. Which are the roles that this passage to prototyping involves? First, we have a designer, then we have the front-end developer who's in charge of transferring the screens to GeneXus, and then we have the back-end developer who's in charge of the business logic. On the screen, you can see that the ones on both extremes are very happy with their tools, whereas the one in the middle is sort of bored because he has to do the job of transferring all the colors, all the fonts, all the styles, which is quite a manual and tedious work. So here we see an opportunity to be able to facilitate that front-end developers' work, transferring that design to development. So let's analyze what the current workflow is for transferring those designs to implementation. Before that, I want to tell you that the examples I will be giving now will be more web-oriented, but we have also thought some of those for SD. Let's begin with a classification. We have the case of when we have hired one designer or when we have an in-house designer, and then there's another case when we buy ready-made design. There are many sites where you can buy very good designs which are pre-designed, and it would be up to the programmer to then transfer that design to something that's functional. Another classification is about the designer type. We have designers who use tools similar to Photoshop, where they work with images, and others which are those that know more about HTML and give us HTML code directly. This is for both cases when we either have our own designer or we buy ready-made design. We can buy ready-made design in Photoshop or in HTML. Let's first see the Photoshop case. This is an example we had. You can download this. This is a CRM which was done in Photoshop by one of our designers. And what we did was, when it was finished, we gave a set of screens to the person who was going to implement that. Here we see a grid, we see the lines, and on the left there are some filters. Then there was another screen without the filters, and then another screen where on the right a menu would pop up, and there were several screens explaining how these screens should look like in the end application. Besides from that, we also gave template with the colors and fonts and sizes of everything that will appear on the screen, together with a set of resources. In this case, we're talking about images. And with all of that, the programmer had to use GeneXus for his implementation. Even though design, as you can see, is very nice, the work of the job of transferring this to GeneXus took some time. This would be the case of the Photoshop designer. Let's now analyze the web designer case, where we receive HTML. We have the same example, and this HTML, which is obvious. Here, designers are based on some frameworks which you probably know already, such as Bootstrap or Foundation, and do that design. Another way of web designers to work with are tools, which is called Amaco, which has the advantage of being very similar to how you interact with Photoshop, but on the bottom, underneath it, you have HTML and CCCs. Photoshop has its own format, which is PSD, but in this case, it saves HTML directly, and that's what the developer gets. Now we've come to the part of the ideas that we have to improve this passage from design to implementation. First, let's get back to Photoshop. It allows us to have plugins. Some of them export to CSS. Some of them we use them. We have CSS3PS. We use that internally. There are other plugins that export HTML, and we want to have our own plugin to export what the designer has in Photoshop. I say Photoshop because it's the most important one, but there might be for some others as well. Why don't we want to do this? Because here, this folder structure is the one that the designer has when in Photoshop, and when we receive the images, he is sort of dividing this structure, which is a structure that could be reused when doing those screens. So we want to reuse that, and with a plugin to send that to GeneXus in such a way that we can reuse the information. Now, getting to the other case. This is the case when I have a designer that hands me HTML information. HTML is HTML, CSS plus JavaScript. The idea is that the CSS and JavaScript go directly to the final part, and HTML needs to go to through GeneXus, because we need to be able to change data, because designer gives us static data so that they look nice in our test, but in GeneXus we need to make them dynamic with the data from the database, so they necessarily need to go through GeneXus. And how would I tell GeneXus what it needs to make dynamic? Here there's an example. This example is one of those that can be bought off the rack. This is, of course, a shopping site. I forgot to tell you that this technology is called live abstraction. And what I'll do is show you an example about this. I will focus on the top part, top right, top left. Here we have an image. If you click the right button on that image, you will see a menu, and that menu has an option which is Inspect Elements. If you click there, you will see the developer tools. Those tools position you in the HTML in the corresponding place to the image that you have clicked. So on one hand, you have what you see on the browser, and on the other hand, the corresponding HTML to that node. What we did as a prototype was to select something, to mark it in the browser, so that I can tell the browser what this corresponds to in GeneXus. What we did was to give 5 possibilities: attribute, variable, constant, grid, or an action. Why these 5? Because, as was already mentioned before, GeneXus is based on data. What GeneXus cares about is data, the controls that go on top, and the style with that secondary. So, first of all, we need to tell GeneXus what type of data we have. In this case, this image is constant, so we click constant. Another example is when we have a set of repetitive data, so it will be a grid. This grid, the grid is marked in blue, and in red we will see an item from that grid. Even though you don't need to know a lot about HTML, you can see that there is a set of repetitive tags that correspond to each item. We would need to mark one of them, and then for that item we will determine what part corresponds to the product image, what part corresponds to product price, product description, and any other associated action by linking it to each of the elements of HTML. Another example of a grid where I have repetitive data, this corresponds to control carousel, as you might know. Even though this control is different for GeneXus, it's pretty much the same. It's a grid with items. So HTML becomes more complicated, but we have repetitive data called SM4, and this corresponds to each of the items. So I will do the same. I mark one item, and inside that item I will determine which are its contents. That's a way for indicating GeneXus which parts of HTML it needs to replace. It's sort of low level, but we need to do that somehow so that GeneXus understands this. Besides from that, something that we could also do is to recognize some tags which we already know what they mean. Tag A in HTML indicates a link, a hyperlink. So we could say that this in GeneXus corresponds to an action that goes somewhere else. The IMG tag corresponds to an image, so we could assume that it corresponds to a constant or variable or attribute, so we could tell GeneXus to choose one of those. We could also extend this to Bootstrap and say to recognize certain things such as drop down or the carousel side. Finally, something we can do with this live abstraction property is to obtain the resources that we have in that page. Some resources will be useful for prototyping. For example, I have to point out that here, these ones here, which are images, will be useful for initialization data for prototyping. When I start a prototype, instead of starting from scratch, I could have some testing data. The same for this, which is product and description, and other data could be used for production purposes. So automatically I could be importing all of this to the KB. To conclude, so we have abstract design on one hand, and the prototype we want to obtain. But instead of having someone who has to work manually, what we want to do instead is that to shorten the distance between design and prototyping by automating as best as possible so that we have time to do other more important things. Thank you very much.